Welcome. Welcome to week 4 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University. So just to review, again, 2 topics, Iraq WMD and 9/11 case studies. I hope you definitely took a lot out of this course because it'll be critical for your next paper, which I'll talk about in detail in a second. But Iraq WMD, and as I mentioned, as we go through these case studies, look at it from the intelligence cycle. Where were their failures in collection, analysis, political interface, decision-making by policymakers? Where on that cycle was the failure occur? And Iraq WMD presents failures all along that cycle. There were failures in collection. There was just bad human intelligence tradecraft that I discussed in detail. Pardon me. That I discussed in detail, whether it was about curveball, whether it's about categorizing chemical weapons analysis, whether just relying on UN inspectors that could come in and be ejected and then come in, or not relying on on the UN inspectors in some cases. There certainly was bad intelligence tradecraft used in the Iraq WMD case study. There was failures in analytics when the information was collected and it was processed by the analysts. I talked about groupthink. There certainly was groupthink and confirmation bias around certain of these pieces of evidence displayed. There was just bad scientific incompetence relating to those aluminum tubes. There was negative evidence issues, and I talked about that in detail. Negative evidence where people were focused on evidence for Iraq WMD. Let's try and find these pieces of evidence that there's associations with the WMD program, but no one flipped the script and asked, if Iraq has a nuclear program, why are we only seeing these centrifuges? Shouldn't we be seeing all these other aspects of a nuclear program being imported? That wasn't considered, and that was a huge analytical failure. There was organizational failures, and I mentioned this in the lecture. If all of your intelligence is dependent on what George Tenet says, because he's the guy in the room, and if he says slam dunk, then case closed. You can do all the alternative analysis, devil's advocacy, red teaming, team A, team B, but if he says there's WMD and it's a slam dunk case covered. That's a problem in organization, because now you're dependent on a huge decision on one man's biases and judgment. That is a failure in organization. And then the policy interference. The Rachel Maddow goes into detail on this, and the politicization piece I talk about as well. And obviously there was a issue with briefing intelligence to the policy makers. That interface broke down, and you can explore that in your paper in more detail. So then we move to the 9/11 case study. I ask this again, was 9/11 intelligence failure? I just want to reiterate, I think it is because of the fact that there were 2 known terrorists in the United States who were on watch lists, who, when you watch the NSA documentary, were communicating with a known Bin Laden safe house, yet due to bureaucratic and organizational reasons, that information was not acted on. So yes, I believe it was an intelligence failure because of that fact. But you're welcome to disagree with me on that basis. I brought this up in the last section. What to do Bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. I know a lot of you couldn't watch the National Geographic, and I apologize for it. But for those of you who've seen 9/11, this was briefed to George Bush, in August, a month before the 9/11 incidents, and it was briefed to him, and it was made a big deal because they say he was warned about the 9/11 attack. I don't necessarily believe this, and I don't want to get political here, but a lot of hay has been made about that. But the question is, okay, what do you do now? And let's pretend you're the analyst who briefs that, and he turns around and says, okay, what do you want me to do? As a professional development, you should have a plan in case that happens, so you can bracket the issue. Should I invade Afghanistan? Should I increase the threat level at all civil aviation facilities? Should I knock the heads of the FBI and the CIA together and say, work together to solve this issue. Tell me what I should be doing so I can bracket the problem. So always have that, whether you're briefing intelligence or threat base, that your boss or whoever you're briefing is going to turn around and say, okay, what do you want me to do about this? Just be cognizant of that. And then the organizational issues. So I talked about organizational failures before. I'll talk about it in a second. But obviously the NSA documentary goes into this in detail. Known terrorists were in San Diego communicating with known bin Laden. Our government knew about it, but nothing was done because of organizational issues. This part of NSA knew about it, but this action arm at the FBI or the San Diego police didn't know about it. Why? What was the failure? Why couldn't this guy communicate with this guy? And again, it was bureaucratic issues, classification issues, all those personality issues, as you saw in the documentary. Those issues are kind of fall under the umbrella of organizational problems that led to this failure. And then I ask, where along in the chain could federal, state, and government have prevented 9/11? And this talks about the fusion centers a little bit more in detail, and we'll talk about this in next week's lecture. But there's part of the failure of intelligence is not just boxes, is vertical, but horizontal. Information collected at the federal level, but not disseminated down to state and local levels. And that is still an issue to this day, despite the DHS fusion centers that we spent all this money on, despite all the post 9/11 incidents. And I'll talk about that in detail. So paper two is due next week. The presenters will be presenting next week, and here's some more guidance on it. I'm not going to give you an example of the paper, but I'm going to tell you kind of where the guidance is. So strategic paper, focus on the case studies that we've already used. If you want to use another case study, ask me now. Ask me when you acknowledge this paper. And again, there's some case studies that are good. I've had people talk about the Indian nuclear tests. I heard people talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you're welcome to use those, but please get approval of it now. Do not use the week 5 case studies. That is not part of this paper. Use the case studies that we talked about. I'll allow you to choose, so you go two ways about this. I have some questions on this. Some people will use a case study and go in detail and show how the intelligence failed in that case study. Or other people will take an intelligence issue like negative evidence or bad collection methodology, and they will use multiple case studies to show how that issue weaved its way into the intelligence failures. I will let you choose one or the other. I will also say is don't give me a laundry list. A lot of you did this, and it's okay in the discussion section. You could say Pearl Harbor, all these indicators, 10 indicators should have been known, but they didn't, and that's why it's an intel failure. Don't do that for me. One, tell me where the failure occurred in collection analysis, go in depth, and I want depth. 2 or 3 issues that you think are the most important. Again, there's 15 reasons you can explain why 9/11 happened. I don't want 15 reasons. I want what you think was the primary reason, and I want you to back it up with evidence. That is key. Please do that. Okay? Failures, just again, some of the case studies that are going out. If you want to talk about failures in collection, Pearl Harbor case study, the inability to track the Japanese aircraft carriers, the Yom Kippur War, the reliance on one single source for human. Those are all failures in collection. The Iraq War, I talked about curveball and other human issues. Failures in analysis. Pearl Harbor, again, there was numerous failures that the J2 Pacific Command failed, or the G2 failed, and many of you talked about the indicators that were failed. The confessions, massive failures in groupthink, confirmation bias, vividness bias, negative evidence, all led to that false conviction for those 4 folks in the Norfolk 4. Feel free to expound on that. And Iraq WMD, I talked about the groupthink that may have led to some of the erroneous analysis. Politicization and policy interference, Iraq WMD, I just talked about that, so I'm not going to reiterate that. The confessions, arguably the pressure put on Detective Ford forced him to make assessments that were erroneous. That is politicization of intelligence, just in a different context. And then 9/11, I talked about the interface between talking to briefing policymakers and the bin Laden determined to attack the U.S. portion. And then organizational. 9/11, I talked about the failures in organizational intelligence. Pearl Harbor, again, information was collected at the federal level, but it was not disseminated down to the commanders on the ground because of organizational constraints. Feel free to explore that topic in detail. And then the fusion centers, if you want to talk about these in detail, you can say how information either is or isn't being pushed down from the federal level to state and local levels that can actually do something about it. So here I gave you a laundry list. Do not just reiterate this laundry list back to me. I'm giving you options where you can choose from to put a topic on your paper. So again, about 1,200 to 1,500 words. Let me know if there's any issues. I am available to email back and forth this week. I am available to talk on the phone if need be. And again, please listen to the lessons I just mentioned. And I look forward to groups 1, 2, and 3, their presentations next Sunday. And I should warn you, those presentations, I expect them to be about 20 minutes, give or take a few minutes, and then 5 or 10 minutes for questions. PowerPoint presentation for those who are presenting. If your whole group can't be there, that's fine. Just make sure the person that can brief is well-versed in the subject and can answer questions whether they come from me or other members of the group. So that wraps up paper 2. Week 5, again, 7.5 week class. We got no time for breaks. That's the deal. So you have the counterterrorism case studies. You have the readings. The Fort Hood shooting reading I need to replace. I will look about trying to find a PDF copy because the link is broken, so I apologize for that. I also have a documentary that I'm going to post in this discussion, just a 6-minute short documentary on Fort Hood that you should watch as well. The Boston Marathon bombing, you have the case study, and then the other 2 documentaries, Christmas Day bomber and the EU terrorism. And the question to think in the back of your head, despite the millions, trillions, or billions, trillions, depending on what you count, that we've spent on counterterrorism, why do we still have these issues? So I look forward to your papers. I know it's a hard week, and if there's issues, please let me know.